I'm standing in my dress blues outside the Pentagon, metals gleaming against the crisp fabric, watching black sedans pull up to discharge dignitaries and officials. The weight of the Medal of Honor around my neck feels surreal, like I'm wearing someone else's honor. In 2 hours, I'll be shaking hands with the President of the United States on national television, but right now, all I can think about is the empty seats reserved for my family in the ceremony hall. When I texted my parents the final details 3 weeks ago, my mother responded with, "Oh honey, that's the same weekend as Jessica's big promotion celebration. We already committed. Maybe next time." Next time, as if receiving the nation's highest military decoration was like a neighborhood barbecue I could reschedule. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Hana Mitchell, and I've spent the last 8 years trying to prove to my family that joining the Army wasn't a cry for help or a desperate escape from my problems. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, I was always the one who didn't quite fit the mold my parents had cast for their children. Jessica, 3 years older, sailed through high school as valedictorian, earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, and landed a prestigious consulting job straight out of college. Mark, 2 years younger, followed almost the same path with a pre-med track at the University of Iowa. Then there was me, struggling with anxiety, barely scraping by in my classes, and spending most of my teenage years feeling like I was disappointing everyone just by existing. When I announced during my senior year that I was enlisting in the Army instead of going to college, the reaction around our dinner table was immediate and devastating. My father, a successful insurance broker who'd built his reputation on calculated risks and safe investments, looked at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. My mother, a high school principal who measured success by academic achievement and social standing, actually started crying. Jessica was home from college that weekend and spent an hour lecturing me about throwing my life away, while Mark just stared at his plate, probably grateful the attention wasn't on him for once. "This is just another one of your phases, Hana," my mother said, her voice tight with frustration. "Remember when you wanted to be a veterinarian? Or when you insisted you were going to art school? You never stick with anything long enough to succeed." The words cut deep because part of me wondered if she was right. I'd always been the family member who started projects and abandoned them, who made grand declarations, and then quietly gave up when things got difficult. But something about the military felt different. When the recruiter talked about serving something bigger than myself, about finding purpose and building skills that mattered, it resonated in a way nothing else ever had. My father tried a different approach, appealing to what he assumed was my practical side. "The Army is fine for some people, sweetheart, but you have options. We can still get you into community college, help you figure out what you really want to do with your life." The implication was clear. The military was for people who didn't have better choices. And his daughter surely deserved better than that. When I tried to explain that I'd researched the combat medic program extensively, that I wanted to help people in emergency situations, that I felt called to serve, they exchanged glances that said everything. Their youngest daughter was having another crisis, making another impulsive decision they'd have to manage and eventually help her recover from. The weeks leading up to my departure for basic training were tense and uncomfortable. Jessica came home for a weekend specifically to stage what she called an intervention, bringing spreadsheets showing projected lifetime earnings for various college degrees versus military service. She meant well, but her presentation felt like another reminder that my family saw my choices as fundamentally flawed. Mark was more supportive, but in a way that suggested he was humoring me, rather than taking my decisions seriously. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "It'll be good for you to get some discipline and structure," he said, as if I were going to military boarding school rather than committing to serve my country. The morning I left for Fort Leonard Wood, my parents drove me to the recruitment station with the resigned air of people fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. My mother hugged me tightly and whispered, "Call us when you're ready to come home. We'll figure something out." Even in that moment, she couldn't conceive that I might actually complete my service successfully, let alone thrive in the military environment. My father shook my hand formally and told me to be careful, but I could see in his eyes that he was already mentally preparing for the phone call, where I'd admit defeat and ask for help getting my life back on track. Basic training was everything I'd expected, and nothing like my family had feared. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't know about my academic struggles or my history of abandoned projects. I was judged purely on my performance, my effort, and my commitment to the team. The physical challenges pushed me beyond what I thought possible, but more importantly, the mental demands gave me a confidence I'd never experienced. When I called home after graduation, my parents sounded surprised that I'd actually completed the program. "Well, that's wonderful, honey," my mother said, her tone suggesting she was checking off a box rather than celebrating an achievement. "Now you can start thinking about what you want to do next." Advanced individual training for combat medics was even more intense, combining medical education with combat preparedness in ways that challenged every aspect of my abilities. I discovered I had a natural aptitude for emergency medicine, an ability to stay calm under pressure that surprised even me. My instructors started noting my potential for leadership roles, and I began to see a future in the military that extended far beyond my family's assumption that I was marking time until I figured out my real life. When I called to tell them I'd graduated at the top of my AIT class and was being assigned to an elite medical unit, my father's response was, "That's nice, dear. Jessica just got promoted to senior analyst at her firm." The comparison stung, but it also clarified something important about my relationship with my family. No matter what I accomplished in the military, it would always be measured against Jessica's corporate success or Mark's medical school achievements. The metrics they used to evaluate worth and accomplishment simply didn't include military service, at least not the kind of service their daughter was providing. When I tried to explain the significance of my assignment, the specialized training I'd receive, the opportunities for advanced medical education the Army would provide, I could hear the polite disinterest in their voices. They were waiting for me to finish this phase of my life and move on to something they could understand and celebrate. My first deployment to Afghanistan came 18 months later, and the conversation about it with my family was painfully brief. When I called to tell them I'd be overseas for 9 months, my mother's immediate concern was whether I'd be back in time for Jessica's wedding. The fact that I'd be serving in a combat zone, providing emergency medical care to wounded soldiers under dangerous conditions, seemed secondary to family scheduling concerns. "Just be safe and don't do anything heroic," my father said, apparently believing that survival was a matter of avoiding unnecessary risks rather than understanding that my job inherently involved putting myself in danger to save others. During deployment, communication with home became sporadic and increasingly superficial. My parents sent care packages filled with items that showed they had no understanding of my living conditions or duties. Jessica wrote occasional emails updating me on her career progress and wedding plans, always ending with variations of, "Hope you're staying out of trouble over there." Mark was the most consistent correspondent, but his messages felt more like checking on a distant cousin than staying connected with a sister serving in combat. When I tried to share meaningful experiences or challenges, the responses were always some version of, "Glad you're safe, can't wait to have you home." Quote, "The disconnect became most apparent during my second deployment, when my unit was assigned to a particularly dangerous region where we regularly came under fire while treating casualties. The work was intense and meaningful in ways I struggled to communicate to people who'd never experienced combat or emergency medicine. I was saving lives daily, developing skills that most civilian medics never acquire, and earning the respect of soldiers whose survival often depended on my expertise. But when I called home after a particularly difficult week where we'd lost 2 soldiers despite our best efforts, my mother's main concern was whether I was eating enough vegetables and getting adequate sleep. It wasn't that my family didn't care about me. I knew they loved me and worried about my safety. But they seemed incapable of understanding that I'd found my calling, that the work I was doing mattered profoundly to me and to the people I served with. In their minds, I was still the confused teenager who'd joined the military as an escape plan, marking time until I came to my senses and pursued a real career. The idea that I might be genuinely happy and fulfilled in military service, that I might be exceptionally good at what I was doing, didn't seem to register as a possibility. The irony was that while my family saw my military service as a detour from success, I was actually building exactly the kind of career that would have impressed them if it had happened in any other context. I'd been promoted ahead of schedule multiple times, selected for advanced training programs, and recommended for leadership positions by officers who saw potential my family couldn't recognize. The medals and commendations I'd earned represented achievements that would have been headline news in our small hometown if anyone had bothered to pay attention to them. 3 years into my career, I was selected for an elite special operations medical team, a position that put me among the most skilled combat medics in the entire Army. The selection process was incredibly competitive, requiring not just medical expertise, but advanced combat training, psychological evaluations, and recommendations from multiple commanding officers. When I called home to share the news, explaining that I'd be working with units whose missions were often classified and always dangerous, my father's response was to ask when I thought I might be ready to use my GI Bill benefits for college. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest we'd ever had about my military service, and also the most painful. I tried to explain that I was already getting education and training that far exceeded what most college programs could offer, that I was developing expertise in emergency medicine and tactical operations that would serve me throughout my career. I described the respect I'd earned from colleagues and superiors, the lives I'd saved, the critical missions I'd supported. But every accomplishment I mentioned was met with polite acknowledgement, followed by suggestions about civilian careers I might consider when I was ready to settle down. "We're proud of you for serving your country, honey," my mother said, using the tone she'd once reserved for praising my elementary school art projects. "But you can't do this forever. What about your future? What about starting a family? Jessica's already talking about children, and Mark will be finishing medical residency soon. Don't you want to build something permanent?" The question revealed everything about how my family viewed my military service, as a temporary adventure rather than a career, as something I was doing to myself rather than for others. That conversation marked a turning point in how I thought about my relationship with my family. I realized that no amount of explanation or achievement would change their fundamental perspective on my choices. They would always see me as the family member who'd taken an unconventional path, someone whose accomplishments needed to be translated into terms they could understand rather than celebrated on their own merits. The recognition and respect I'd earned in the military world would never fully compensate for their perception that I'd chosen a lesser path than my siblings. But I also realized that their approval was no longer essential to my sense of self-worth. The work I was doing mattered, regardless of whether my family understood its significance. The soldiers whose lives I'd saved, the missions I'd supported, the expertise I'd developed, these things had value that didn't depend on external validation. For the first time in my life, I was measuring my success by my own standards, rather than trying to meet expectations set by people who didn't understand my world. The mission that would change everything happened during my 4th deployment, in a region of Afghanistan where our special operations team was supporting counterinsurgency efforts. We'd been inserted into a remote valley to provide medical support for a joint operation involving Afghan forces and U.S. Special Operations units. The mission was supposed to be routine: establish a forward aid station, treat any casualties from the planned operation, and extract within 72 hours. Instead, it became a 4-day siege that would test every skill I'd developed and every ounce of courage I possessed. On the 2nd day, our position came under intense and coordinated attack from insurgent forces who'd apparently been tracking our movements. The initial assault wounded 6 members of our team, including our commanding officer, and left us pinned down in a partially collapsed building with limited supplies and no immediate prospect of extraction. As the senior medic present, I suddenly found myself responsible not only for treating the wounded, but for making tactical decisions that would determine whether any of us survived. The next 72 hours blurred together in a nightmare of constant gunfire, medical emergencies, and impossible decisions. With our communications equipment damaged, I had to coordinate medical care while also directing defensive positions and rationing supplies. 2 of the wounded soldiers required immediate surgery that I had to perform under fire, using improvised equipment and techniques I'd never attempted in combat conditions. When our water ran low, I volunteered for supply runs to a well outside our defensive perimeter, crossing open ground under sniper fire, because the wounded soldiers needed hydration more than I needed safety. By the 4th day, ammunition was running critically low, and I made the decision that would later result in my Medal of Honor recommendation. Intelligence indicated that a larger insurgent force was moving to surround our position, and our only chance of survival was to break out before they could complete the encirclement. But moving the wounded soldiers would require someone to provide covering fire from our current position, essentially a suicide mission. I volunteered to stay behind with the most severely wounded soldier, a 19-year-old from Tennessee who couldn't be moved without risking his life. What followed was the longest 6 hours of my life. Alone with a critically injured soldier, surrounded by enemy forces, I managed to hold our position long enough for the rest of the team to reach a safe extraction point and call in air support. I used every piece of medical equipment we had left to keep the wounded soldier alive, while simultaneously returning fire from multiple positions to create the illusion of a larger defending force. When helicopter gunships finally arrived to clear the area, they found me still treating the wounded soldier, both of us alive against odds that several officers later described as miraculous. The after-action report documented my actions over those 4 days, performing life-saving surgery under fire, making tactical decisions that saved multiple lives, voluntarily staying behind to protect a wounded soldier, and single-handedly holding a defensive position against superior forces. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor came from officers who'd reviewed the mission extensively and concluded that my actions represented extraordinary heroism far beyond the call of duty. But the most meaningful recognition came from the soldiers whose lives I'd saved. Men who told me privately that they owed their survival to my refusal to abandon them under impossible circumstances. Recovery and debriefing took several weeks, during which time the Medal of Honor recommendation worked its way through military channels with unusual speed. The documentation was extensive and the support unanimous. Everyone involved in reviewing the case agreed that my actions represented exactly the kind of heroism the medal was designed to recognize. When I finally called home to tell my family about the mission and the pending award, their reaction was everything I'd come to expect and nothing I'd hoped for. "A medal?" my mother asked, sounding pleased but confused. "That's wonderful, honey. Is it like the ones Jessica got for academic achievement?" When I tried to explain that the Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration in the United States, that it was rarely awarded and never given lightly, she responded with the same polite interest she'd shown for all my military accomplishments. My father was more engaged, asking practical questions about whether the award would help with post-military career prospects, apparently viewing it as a line item from my eventual civilian resume. The conversation that hurt most was with Jessica, who was enthusiastic about the honor but completely missed its significance. "That's so exciting," she said. "It'll be such a nice ceremony for the family to attend. When is it? We're pretty busy with the new house renovations, but I'm sure we can work something out." The casualness of her response, treating the Medal of Honor ceremony like a family gathering she might or might not attend depending on her schedule, crystallized everything about how my family viewed my military service. When I explained that the ceremony would take place at the Pentagon, that the president himself would present the medal, that it would be covered by national media and attended by high-ranking military officials and government dignitaries, the silence on the phone was telling. Jessica's eventual response was, "Oh wow, that's much bigger than I thought. Let me check our calendar and get back to you." The fact that she needed to check her calendar to determine whether she could attend her sister's Medal of Honor ceremony told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. The planning for the ceremony took several months, during which time I was assigned to temporary duty at the Pentagon to work with protocol officers on the event details. The experience was surreal, meeting with White House staff, coordinating with media representatives, reviewing guest lists that included generals and cabinet members. Everyone involved in the planning treated the ceremony with the gravity it deserved, understanding that they were organizing one of the most significant military honors in the country. Meanwhile, my family's engagement with the event remained superficial and conditional. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I sent detailed information to my parents: the date, time, location, dress code, and logistics for family attendance. I explained that the military would cover travel expenses for immediate family members, that they would be seated in a special section reserved for the honoree's family, that they would have opportunities to meet senior military officials and possibly the president himself. I tried to convey not just the honor of receiving the medal, but the significance of having family present to witness this recognition of service and sacrifice. My mother's response came 2 days later, and it shattered something inside me that I hadn't realized was still vulnerable. "Hana, sweetheart, we're so proud of you. But we have a conflict that weekend. Jessica just got promoted to partner at her consulting firm, and we've already planned a big celebration party for her. The whole extended family is coming, and we've put deposits down for the venue and catering. It's just terrible timing. Maybe they could reschedule your ceremony? The suggestion that my Medal of Honor ceremony might be rescheduled to accommodate Jessica's promotion party was so absurd I initially thought she was joking. When I realized she was serious, when it became clear that my family genuinely saw Jessica's promotion party as taking precedence over my Medal of Honor ceremony, I felt something break inside me that I don't think ever fully healed. This wasn't about competing with my sister or needing to be the center of attention. This was about my family's complete inability to recognize the significance of what I'd accomplished, their fundamental misunderstanding of who I'd become and what my service meant. I didn't argue or try to convince them to change their plans. Instead, I simply said, I understand. Family obligations are important. The conversation ended with my mother promising to send a nice card and asking if someone could take pictures to share later. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I'd been waiting 8 years for my family to see me clearly, to recognize that I'd not only found my calling but excelled at it in ways that deserved their respect and pride. That call made it clear they never would. The weeks following that devastating phone call felt like living in a strange parallel universe. On one side, I was working with Pentagon protocol officers and White House staff to finalize details for what they repeatedly called one of the most significant military ceremonies of the year. On the other side, I was receiving casual text messages from my family about Jessica's promotion party, complete with details about the caterer they'd chosen and debates over whether to hire a DJ or stick with background music. The contrast was so stark it felt almost surreal. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the protocol officer assigned to my ceremony, treated every detail with the reverence befitting a Medal of Honor presentation. She walked me through the precise choreography of the event, explaining how I would enter the East Room, where I would stand while the president spoke, how the medal would be presented, and what would happen during the reception afterward. Her team had coordinated similar ceremonies for only 12 other recipients in the past decade, and she spoke about the honor with an awe that seemed completely absent from my family's reaction. Meanwhile, my sister Jessica sent me regular updates about her party planning as if I were just another family member who might attend. She texted photos of floral arrangements and asked my opinion on menu options, seemingly oblivious to the irony of seeking my input for the celebration that was preventing my family from attending my own ceremony. When I didn't respond enthusiastically to her messages about centerpiece designs, she called to ask if everything was okay. "You seem distracted lately," she said. "Is everything all right with your work?" The fact that she referred to my military service as work, in the same tone someone might use to ask about a challenging week at an office job, perfectly encapsulated her understanding of what I did. During one particularly painful conversation, Jessica suggested that my ceremony could actually work out perfectly for everyone. "You know, maybe it's better this way," she said with the confidence of someone who'd found an elegant solution to a complicated problem. "You won't have to worry about us being nervous or out of place at such a formal military thing. And we can have our own celebration for you when you get back. Mom's already talking about making your favorite dinner and maybe inviting some of your old high school friends." The idea that my Medal of Honor ceremony was something my family might feel out of place at, and that a casual dinner with high school acquaintances could somehow substitute for their presence at the most significant moment of my military career, left me speechless. My brother Mark's response was perhaps the most hurtful because it came wrapped in what seemed like genuine concern. He called me a few days after our parents had finalized their decision to skip the ceremony, and his tone was careful and measured, like he was talking to someone who might be having an emotional crisis. "Hana, I hope you understand that this isn't personal," he began. "It's just that Jessica's worked so hard for this promotion, and the timing is really unfortunate. But you know we're proud of you, right? This medal thing is really impressive, even if we don't totally get all the military stuff." The phrase "medal thing" stung more than he probably intended, reducing the highest honor our country can bestow on a service member to the same category as a trophy or certificate. When I tried to explain the significance of the Medal of Honor, the rigorous process of recommendation and approval, the rarity of the award, and the gravity of the actions it recognized, Mark listened politely, but responded with the kind of generalized encouragement, typically reserved for children's achievements. "That's awesome, Hana. You've always been good at helping people, so it makes sense that you'd excel at the medical stuff in the Army. The phrase medical stuff in the Army revealed how little my family understood about what I actually did. Mark, who was completing his residency in internal medicine, somehow managed to reduce my role as a special operations combat medic to generic medical stuff, completely missing the specialized training, tactical expertise, and life-or-death decision-making that my position required. When I mentioned that I'd been performing battlefield surgery and coordinating medical care under fire, he responded with, "Wow, that sounds stressful. I can barely handle the pressure in our emergency room here." The comparison was so fundamentally misguided that I didn't even attempt to correct it. As the ceremony date approached, the disconnect between my professional and personal worlds became even more pronounced. My command assigned me a media liaison officer to prepare for the inevitable interviews and public attention that would follow the ceremony. Captain Rodriguez walked me through potential questions from reporters, explaining that Medal of Honor recipients often became public figures representing the best of military service. You'll probably get requests for speaking engagements, appearances at veteran events, maybe even some opportunities in television or consulting, she explained. The medal opens doors that most people never even see. The same week that Captain Rodriguez was preparing me for national media attention, my mother called to ask if I could bring some of my Army friends to Jessica's promotion party since we were missing their ceremony anyway. The request was made with the casual assumption that military personnel were interchangeable social accessories, like +1s who could fill out a guest list. When I explained that the soldiers I served with were stationed around the world and most were currently deployed, my mother suggested that I could probably find some local veterans who might enjoy a nice party. The idea that my military colleagues were professional peers with their own lives and commitments, rather than convenient social contacts, seemed not to have occurred to her. The isolation I felt during this period was profound and unexpected. I'd grown accustomed to my family's limited understanding of my military career, but I hadn't anticipated how their absence would magnify that disconnect during such a significant moment. Other Medal of Honor recipients I spoke with during preparation sessions all described their ceremonies as deeply meaningful family events, moments when loved ones finally grasped the significance of their service. Many talked about parents or spouses who had worried about their military careers finally understanding that their loved one had achieved something truly extraordinary. Lieutenant Colonel James Park, who had received his Medal of Honor 3 years earlier, became an informal mentor during the preparation process. He described his own ceremony with evident emotion, talking about how his elderly father, who had immigrated from Korea and never fully understood American military culture, wept when the president placed the medal around his neck. "That was the moment my dad finally got it," he said. "Not just what I did on that particular mission, but what it meant to serve. What all the years of training and deployment had been building toward." His story highlighted what I would be missing, that moment of recognition and shared pride that could have transformed my relationship with my family. The media attention began weeks before the ceremony, with reporters reaching out for background interviews and feature stories about my service and the mission that earned the medal. The questions were uniformly respectful and well-informed, focusing on my journey from small-town Iowa to special operations, the specific actions during the mission in Afghanistan, and what the medal meant to me personally. When reporters asked about my family's reaction to the honor, I found myself giving carefully neutral responses about their pride and support, unable to admit publicly that they wouldn't be attending the ceremony. The contrast between public recognition and private disappointment became even sharper when my hometown newspaper ran a feature story about my upcoming Medal of Honor ceremony. The article, which appeared on the front page with a large photo of me in dress uniform, described my military career in detail and quoted several local officials expressing pride in having such a distinguished veteran from their community. The mayor announced plans for a special recognition ceremony when I next visited Cedar Falls, and the high school I'd graduated from indicated they were planning to add my photo to their wall of distinguished alumni. When the newspaper article came out, I received dozens of calls and messages from former teachers, high school classmates, and family friends, expressing congratulations and excitement about the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson, my high school guidance counselor who had once expressed skepticism about my military plans, called to apologize for not better understanding my goals and to say how proud she was of what I'd accomplished. Former classmates who I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to share their amazement at my achievements and to express their intention to watch the ceremony coverage on television. The irony was overwhelming. People I barely knew from my hometown were making plans to watch my Medal of Honor ceremony on TV, while my immediate family was planning a party to celebrate my sister's promotion the same weekend. The guidance counselor who had once doubted my path was calling to congratulate me, while my parents were asking if the ceremony could be rescheduled to accommodate their social calendar. Acquaintances were telling me how proud they were to know a Medal of Honor recipient, while my siblings were treating the award like an interesting achievement that ranked somewhere below a promotion at a consulting firm. During this period, I found myself questioning not just my family's priorities but my own expectations. Had I been naive to think they would understand the significance of this moment? Was I being unfair to expect them to prioritize my ceremony over Jessica's celebration? The rational part of my mind acknowledged that they had committed to her party first, that they were proud of me in their own way, that their absence didn't diminish the honor itself. But the emotional reality was that I felt abandoned during what should have been the proudest moment of my military career. The psychological preparation for receiving the Medal of Honor included counseling sessions designed to help recipients cope with the attention and responsibility that comes with the award. Dr. Sarah Chin, a psychologist who specialized in working with military personnel, spent several sessions helping me process not just the mission that earned the medal but the broader implications of receiving such recognition. During one session, I found myself discussing my family's absence and the isolation I felt around what should have been a celebration. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my family's reaction, while painful, was actually quite common among military families who had never fully grasped the significance of their loved one's service. The Medal of Honor often serves as a moment of revelation for families, she explained. Sometimes it helps them finally understand what their service member has been doing all along, but sometimes it highlights just how different their worlds have become. Her insight was helpful but didn't diminish the hurt of facing this moment alone. As the ceremony approached, practical details became emotional landmines. The Pentagon Protocol Office needed final numbers for the family section, and I had to explain that no immediate family members would be attending. The White House liaison asked about family members who might want to participate in the reception following the ceremony, and I had to decline those opportunities as well. Each conversation about family arrangements was a reminder of their absence and a small humiliation as I tried to explain the situation without sounding bitter or abandoned. Emma Chen, my closest friend from high school who had stayed in touch throughout my military career, offered to attend the ceremony as my guest. Emma was one of the few people from my past who had taken genuine interest in my military service, asking detailed questions about my training and deployments, celebrating my promotions and achievements with real understanding of their significance. When I told her about my family's decision to skip the ceremony, her reaction was immediate and fierce. "Are you kidding me?" she said. "Your sister's promotion party is more important than your Medal of Honor ceremony? What is wrong with them?" Emma's outrage on my behalf was both validating and painful. It confirmed that my family's priorities were as skewed as I thought, but it also highlighted how alone I felt in my disappointment. Emma immediately arranged time off from her job as a nurse in Des Moines and booked travel to Washington, insisting that I shouldn't face this moment without someone who truly understood its significance. Her support meant more to me than I could express, but it also emphasized the absence of the people who should have been there by default. The final week before the ceremony brought a flurry of last-minute preparations and media requests. I participated in interviews with major news networks, posed for official photographs, and completed final rehearsals for the ceremony itself. Throughout all of these activities, other participants consistently asked about my family's excitement and travel plans, and I perfected a series of vague responses that acknowledged their pride without revealing their absence. The small deceptions felt necessary, but added another layer of isolation to an already difficult situation. 2 days before the ceremony, I received a package from my family containing what my mother described as a little something to let you know we're thinking of you. Inside was a generic congratulations card signed by all 4 family members, a small American flag pin that might have been purchased at any gift shop, and a brief note expressing pride in my service and regret that they couldn't attend. The gesture felt perfunctory rather than heartfelt, like something they'd assembled out of obligation rather than genuine emotion. The contrast with Emma's approach was stark. She arrived in Washington a day early and insisted on taking me to dinner at a restaurant near the Pentagon, where she listened to me describe the mission that earned the medal with the kind of intense attention my family had never shown from my military experiences. She asked detailed questions about my tactical decisions, my medical procedures, and the leadership challenges I'd faced during those 4 days in Afghanistan. For the first time since my family had announced their absence, I felt truly heard and understood by someone who mattered to me. That night, lying in my hotel room at the Army-Navy Club where Medal of Honor recipients traditionally stayed before their ceremonies, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 8 years earlier, I had left Cedar Falls as a confused teenager seeking direction and purpose. Tomorrow, I would receive the nation's highest military honor from the president himself. The transformation was remarkable by any measure, but it felt incomplete without the recognition and presence of the people who had known me longest. The silence from my family that final night was deafening. No calls wishing me luck, no messages expressing excitement about watching the ceremony, no last-minute changes of heart about their priorities. Instead, I received a group photo from Jessica's promotion party preparation, showing the entire family gathered around elaborate floral arrangements, looking festive and celebratory. The timing of the photo felt particularly cruel, arriving just hours before I would walk into the East Room of the White House to receive the Medal of Honor alone. As I prepared for sleep that night, I made peace with the reality that my family would never fully understand or appreciate what I had accomplished in the military. Their absence from the ceremony was painful but also clarifying. It freed me from the need to seek their validation or approval for my choices. Tomorrow, I would be recognized by the highest levels of government and military leadership for extraordinary service to my country. That recognition would have to be enough, regardless of who was or wasn't present to witness it. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cold, with that particular crispness that Washington gets in late autumn. I woke before my alarm, my mind immediately sharp and focused despite the emotional weight of the day. As I went through my morning routine, shower, careful grooming, putting on my dress uniform with its array of ribbons and decorations, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. This was my day, my achievement, my moment of recognition, whether my family was present to witness it or not. The East Room of the White House was more magnificent than any photograph could capture. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across cream-colored walls adorned with portraits of presidents, while morning sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the south lawn. As I stood in the adjacent hallway with the protocol officers, waiting for my cue to enter, I could hear the assembled crowd settling into their seats. The guest list read like a directory of American leadership, cabinet members, congressional representatives, joint chiefs of staff, and military heroes whose names I'd studied in military history courses. Colonel Hayes appeared at my elbow, her expression both proud and sympathetic. She'd been briefed about my family's absence and had gone out of her way to ensure I felt supported throughout the morning preparations. "Ready, Medal of Honor recipient Mitchell?" she asked, using the title that would be mine in just a few minutes. The formality of her address helped steady my nerves and reminded me that I was here on merit, not as someone's daughter or sister, but as a soldier who had earned the nation's highest recognition through my own actions. The military aide announced my entrance, and I walked into the East Room with the measured pace I'd practiced dozens of times. The assembled crowd rose as one, their applause thunderous and sustained. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the presidential podium, where President Williams waited with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. Behind him stood General Martinez, the Army Chief of Staff, and Secretary of Defense Thompson, both men whose careers I'd followed and whose respect I'd earned through 8 years of exemplary service. As I took my position facing the president, I caught sight of Emma in the third row, her nurse's uniform replaced by an elegant navy dress, her face glowing with pride and excitement. Seeing her there, representing not just personal friendship, but professional respect from someone who understood dedication and service, helped fill some of the emptiness left by my family's absence. She mouthed, "I'm so proud of you," and I felt a surge of gratitude for her presence and support. President Williams stepped forward to begin the citation reading, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate room. The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, March 3, 1863, has awarded in the name of Congress the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Hana Mitchell, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty. The formal language gave weight to what followed, a detailed account of those 4 days in Afghanistan that had changed everything. As the President described the mission, the ambush, the casualties, and my response, I found myself transported back to that collapsed building where everything had hung in the balance. But hearing the events described in the formal language of the citation, surrounded by the most powerful people in the country, gave those experiences a gravity and significance that even I hadn't fully grasped. The President spoke of my surgical procedures under fire with the same respect typically reserved for breakthrough medical research. He described my tactical decisions with the authority of someone who understood military strategy at the highest levels. Staff Sergeant Mitchell's extraordinary heroism, selfless service, and devotion to duty reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army, the President concluded. Her actions epitomize the finest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself and the armed forces of the United States. The applause that followed was different from the polite recognition that had greeted my entrance. This was sustained, emotional, and came from people who understood exactly what those words represented. The actual presentation of the medal was surprisingly intimate despite the formal setting. President Williams stepped close enough that I could see the genuine respect in his eyes as he placed the medal around my neck. The weight of it was substantial, both physically and symbolically, and I felt the magnitude of joining a brotherhood that included fewer than 3,500 recipients in the entire history of the award. "Thank you for your service, Staff Sergeant Mitchell," the President said quietly, his words meant for me alone rather than the assembled crowd. "Your country is grateful for your sacrifice and heroism." The reception that followed the ceremony was unlike any military event I'd ever attended. Cabinet members approached to shake my hand and express their personal admiration for my service. General Martinez spent 20 minutes discussing my career trajectory and suggesting opportunities for advanced leadership positions that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Congressional representatives who served on military committees sought my opinions on veteran healthcare and combat medic training programs, treating my insights as expert testimony rather than anecdotal experience. Emma moved through the reception with obvious amazement, later telling me that she'd never imagined such a level of respect and recognition existed for military service. She watched me discuss medical innovations with the Surgeon General, compare tactical experiences with other Medal of Honor recipients, and receive invitations to speak at military academies and veteran organizations. "Hana," she whispered during a brief quiet moment, "these people are treating you like you're famous. Like you're genuinely important to them." Her observation helped me realize that the recognition I was receiving represented more than personal achievement. It was acknowledgement of expertise and leadership that transcended my individual story. The media attention following the ceremony was immediate and intense. As we left the White House, reporters clustered around the entrance, shouting questions about my background, my military career, and my future plans. The questions were respectful but persistent, and I found myself drawing on the media training Captain Rodriguez had provided to give thoughtful responses about military service, veteran issues, and the importance of supporting our troops. One reporter from CNN asked specifically about my family's reaction to the honor, and I managed to deflect with a general comment about their pride and support without revealing their absence from the ceremony. The real revelation came that evening when I returned to my hotel room and began checking messages on my phone. The first indication that something had changed was a text from my high school friend Kevin, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a year. "Holy shit, Hana, you're on every news channel. My whole family is watching you with the president right now. I'm telling everyone I know you." Similar messages began flooding in from former classmates, distant relatives, and acquaintances who had seen the ceremony coverage and were reaching out to express amazement and congratulations. But the messages that really caught my attention were from people in Cedar Falls. Mrs. Patterson, who had been my neighbor growing up, sent a photo of her entire family gathered around their television watching ceremony replays. The local coffee shop, where I'd worked weekends during high school, posted on social media about their hometown hero receiving the Medal of Honor. Former teachers, coaches, and family friends were all sharing news stories about my ceremony and expressing pride in knowing me. The recognition was overwhelming and gratifying in ways I hadn't expected. The silence from my immediate family, however, was deafening. No messages, no calls, no acknowledgement that I had just received the highest honor our country can bestow on a service member. While my phone buzzed constantly with congratulations from acquaintances and strangers, the people who should have been most proud remained conspicuously absent from the celebration. The contrast was so stark that Emma, who was monitoring social media coverage from her own hotel room, called to ask if I'd heard from my parents yet. "Nothing," I told her, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Radio silence since yesterday." Emma's response was immediate and fierce. "That's insane, Hana. You just had dinner with the President of the United States. You're on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. How are they not calling you right now?" Her incredulity helped validate my own disbelief, but it also highlighted the growing distance between my family's world and the recognition I was receiving everywhere else. The next morning brought even more surprises. I woke to discover that the ceremony had been front-page news in major newspapers across the country, with my photo alongside the president prominently displayed. The coverage focused not just on the medal presentation, but on my background story. The small-town girl who had found her calling in military service and risen to the highest levels of recognition. Several articles specifically mentioned my hometown of Cedar Falls, with reporters having contacted local officials for quotes about my character and potential. The calls began early that morning. The first was from a producer at Good Morning America, asking if I would appear on the show to discuss my military career and the mission that earned the medal. Within an hour, I had similar requests from Today, CNN, Fox News, and several national radio programs. The attention was flattering but overwhelming, and I found myself relying on the media training I'd received to navigate interviews that would reach millions of viewers. During a live interview with ABC News, the host asked about my journey from Iowa to the Medal of Honor, and I found myself describing my military career in terms that even my family should have been able to understand. I talked about the advanced medical training, the leadership responsibilities, the tactical expertise required for special operations, and the deep satisfaction of serving something greater than myself. As I spoke, I realized I was finally articulating the significance of my career path in a way that should have been obvious to anyone who cared to listen. The interviewer then asked about my hometown's reaction to the honor, and I described the supportive messages I'd received from Cedar Falls residents, teachers, and former classmates. The question I'd been dreading came next. What did your family think when they learned you'd be receiving the Medal of Honor? I managed to deflect with a comment about their longtime pride in my service, but the answer felt hollow even to me. The interview concluded with the host, noting that America was fortunate to have service members like me protecting our freedoms, words that resonated more deeply than similar comments had in the past. By midday, the recognition had reached levels that surprised even the Pentagon protocol officers who had coordinated similar ceremonies. My phone was ringing constantly with interview requests, speaking invitations, and offers from organizations wanting to honor my service. The mayor of Cedar Falls called personally to invite me to a homecoming ceremony whenever I could visit. The governor of Iowa issued a statement praising my service and announcing plans for special recognition. Even my old high school was planning to retire my jersey number from the track team I'd briefly joined as a sophomore. The contrast with my family's silence became even more pronounced when I received a call from Sergeant Williams, one of the soldiers whose life I had saved during the mission in Afghanistan. He'd been following the media coverage from his current assignment in Germany and called to express his gratitude again for my actions that day. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I just wanted you to know that my whole family watched the ceremony yesterday. My kids now know the name of the person who saved their daddy's life. You're a hero to people you've never met, and that medal represents all of us who came home because of what you did." His words hit me harder than all the media attention and public recognition combined. This was why I served, why the mission in Afghanistan had mattered, why the Medal of Honor represented something larger than personal achievement. I had saved lives, protected my fellow soldiers, and upheld the values that made military service meaningful. The validation from Sergeant Williams and the other soldiers I'd served with was worth more than any family celebration could have been. That afternoon brought the most surprising development yet. My phone rang with a call from an unknown number that turned out to be Colonel Patricia Hayes, from the Pentagon Protocol Office. "Hana," she said, her voice containing an excitement I hadn't heard before, "I have some interesting news. We've been monitoring media coverage of your ceremony, and the response has been extraordinary. The Secretary of Defense would like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss some special opportunities that have arisen from the public attention." The meeting the next day was held in Secretary Thompson's personal office at the Pentagon, a space that commanded respect through its understated elegance and walls lined with military history. Secretary Thompson, a former Marine general whose reputation for straight talk was legendary, greeted me with the kind of respect typically reserved for senior officers. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," he began, "your ceremony has generated more positive media coverage for military service than any event in recent memory. The White House has received thousands of messages from Americans expressing pride in your service and gratitude for your sacrifice." What followed was a conversation about opportunities I had never imagined. The Secretary explained that the Department of Defense wanted to leverage the positive attention from my Medal of Honor ceremony to highlight military service and veteran issues. They were offering me a position as a spokesperson for military medical services, with opportunities to testify before Congress, appear at recruiting events, and represent the Army at high-profile public occasions. The role would come with promotion to Sergeant First Class, an assignment to the Pentagon, where I would work directly with senior leadership on veteran affairs. Additionally, Secretary Thompson continued, we've received inquiries from several universities about honorary degrees, from medical organizations about keynote speaking opportunities, and from veteran advocacy groups about leadership positions. The Medal of Honor has opened doors for you that extend far beyond military service. The scope of recognition he described was overwhelming and humbling, representing a level of influence and respect I had never anticipated. As I left the Pentagon that afternoon, my mind was spinning with possibilities I had never considered. The Medal of Honor had transformed me from a small-town soldier into a national figure with opportunities to shape policy, influence public opinion, and represent the best of military service. The recognition I was receiving from the highest levels of government and military leadership was gratifying beyond anything I could have imagined when I first enlisted 8 years earlier. But the silence from my family remained absolute. 3 days after receiving the nation's highest military honor, after appearing on national television with the president, after being featured on front pages across the country, I still had not received a single message from my parents or siblings acknowledging the ceremony or the recognition it represented. Their absence from this moment of triumph was becoming more conspicuous and painful with each passing day. That evening, as I sat in my hotel room reviewing interview requests and speaking invitations, I realized that my family's recognition was no longer necessary for my sense of accomplishment or self-worth. The validation I was receiving from military leadership, government officials, fellow veterans, and the American public was overwhelming and meaningful in ways their approval could never match. I had found my place in a community that understood and valued my service, even if my biological family never would. The transformation was profound and irreversible. In just a few days, I had gone from being the family disappointment who had chosen an unconventional path to being a nationally recognized hero, whose expertise and leadership were sought by the highest levels of American society. The Medal of Honor had not just recognized my past service, it had opened a future filled with opportunities to serve my country in ways I was only beginning to understand. The call came at 7:23 a.m. on Thursday morning, 4 days after the ceremony. I was reviewing notes for an upcoming interview with 60 Minutes when my phone displayed a number I recognized but hadn't seen in weeks, my mother's cell phone. For a moment, I stared at the screen, uncertain whether to answer. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to maintain the distance that their absence had created. But curiosity won, and I accepted the call. "Hana?" My mother's voice sounded strange, higher-pitched than usual, with an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "Honey, we just saw you on the morning news. You were talking to that reporter about your medal and your new job at the Pentagon." There was a pause, filled with the kind of silence that suggested she was struggling to find words. We had no idea it was such a big deal. The ceremony, I mean. They're saying you're famous now. The conversation that followed was surreal in its awkwardness. My mother asked questions about the media attention, as if she were inquiring about an interesting development in a neighbor's life rather than discussing her own daughter's national recognition. She wanted to know if I would be on television again, whether the interviews paid anything, and if the Pentagon job came with a salary increase. The questions revealed how completely she had missed the significance of everything that had happened, reducing the Medal of Honor and its aftermath to practical concerns about career advancement and media appearances. "Your father saw you on CNN yesterday," she continued, her tone brightening as if she'd remembered something important. "He said you looked very professional talking to that woman about military health care. He thinks this could be good for your resume when you decide to leave the Army and get a real job." The phrase "real job" hit like a physical blow, demonstrating that even after 8 years of military service and the nation's highest decoration, my father still viewed my career as a temporary detour from civilian employment. When I tried to explain that my new position at the Pentagon was precisely the kind of influential role I'd been working toward throughout my military career, my mother responded with polite confusion. "Well, that's wonderful, dear. It sounds very important. Although I'm not sure why they need you to do interviews and public speaking. Isn't that what politicians are for?" Her inability to grasp that military leadership included public representation and policy advocacy crystallized everything about how my family viewed my professional capabilities. The most painful moment came when my mother mentioned Jessica's promotion party, which had apparently been a great success. "Everyone asked about you," she said with obvious pride. "We showed them the newspaper article about your medal, and they were all so impressed. Mrs. Henderson said she had no idea you'd become so accomplished in the military. Jessica felt a little bad that her party was the same weekend as your ceremony, but she was glad to see you getting recognition too." The casual reference to their choice, framed as an unfortunate coincidence rather than a deliberate decision to prioritize Jessica's celebration over my Medal of Honor ceremony, revealed how little they understood about what they had missed. In their minds, they had simply attended one family celebration instead of another, unaware that they had chosen a promotion party over one of the most significant military honors in American history. The disconnect was so profound that I found myself wondering if we were discussing the same events. As the call concluded, my mother asked when I might visit Cedar Falls so the family could properly celebrate my achievement. The offer felt hollow and belated, like an obligation they felt compelled to fulfill now that my recognition had become publicly visible. When I mentioned that my schedule was filling up with official duties and speaking engagements, she responded with surprised delight. "How exciting! You're becoming quite the little celebrity, aren't you?" The diminutive language reduced my new role to entertainment, rather than recognizing it as serious professional responsibility. The contrast with the phone call I received an hour later was stark and revealing. General Martinez himself called to discuss my transition to the Pentagon and the specific projects I would be working on in my new role. He spoke equals about congressional testimony I would provide on veteran healthcare initiatives, international conferences where I would represent American military medical capabilities, and policy development sessions where my field experience would inform national strategy. The conversation lasted 45 minutes and covered responsibilities that would influence military medicine for years to come. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," General Martinez concluded, "your expertise and credibility as a Medal of Honor recipient give you a unique platform to advocate for military personnel and veterans. The Department of Defense is counting on your leadership to advance initiatives that could transform how we approach combat medicine and veteran care." The gravity and respect in his voice contrasted sharply with my mother's casual references to celebrity and resume building, highlighting the chasm between my family's understanding and the actual significance of my position. The media requests continued to pour in throughout the week, each one representing opportunities to influence public perception of military service and veteran issues. A producer from 60 Minutes wanted to feature my story as part of a segment on women in combat roles. The History Channel requested my participation in a documentary about Medal of Honor recipients. Harvard Medical School invited me to deliver a keynote address about emergency medicine in combat environments. Each invitation came with the implicit understanding that my voice now carried authority and influence that extended far beyond my individual experience. The speaking engagement that meant the most to me came from an unexpected source, the Iowa Medical Association, which invited me to address their annual conference about trauma medicine and emergency care. The invitation letter specifically mentioned my background as a small-town Iowa native, who had developed expertise in the most challenging medical environments imaginable. For the first time since my military career began, someone from my home state was recognizing my professional achievements in the context of my Iowa roots, rather than despite them. As I prepared for these new responsibilities, I began to understand that the Medal of Honor had fundamentally altered not just how others saw me, but how I saw myself. For 8 years, I had defined my success largely in reaction to my family's expectations, proving that military service could be meaningful and rewarding despite their skepticism. Now, I was being recognized by people who had never doubted the value of military service, who saw my achievements as natural progressions of dedication and excellence, rather than surprising departures from expected paths. The transformation became most apparent during a lunch meeting with Dr. Patricia Stone, the Surgeon General of the Army, who wanted to discuss my role in developing new combat medic training protocols. Dr. Stone, herself a trailblazer who had risen to the highest medical position in the Army, spoke to me as a peer and collaborator, rather than a subordinate receiving instructions. She valued my field experience and tactical expertise, seeking my input on policies that would affect thousands of future combat medics. Your mission in Afghanistan demonstrated exactly the kind of integrated medical and tactical decision-making we need to build into our training programs, Dr. Stone explained over lunch at the Pentagon Officers Club. The traditional model of medics as purely medical personnel doesn't match the reality of modern combat operations. We need combat medics who can think strategically, lead under pressure, and adapt medical protocols to tactical situations. Her words validated not just my actions during that specific mission, but the entire approach to military medicine I had developed throughout my career. The conversation evolved into a planning session for a new combat medic leadership program that would incorporate lessons learned from recent operations in Afghanistan and other theaters. Dr. Stone wanted me to help design the curriculum, drawing on my experience to create training that would better prepare future medics for the complex challenges they would face in combat. The responsibility was both humbling and energizing, representing an opportunity to influence military medicine at the institutional level. The recognition extended beyond military circles when I received an invitation to testify before the House Veterans Affairs Committee about healthcare access for female veterans. The committee chair, Representative Sarah Davis, had specifically requested my participation based on my combination of combat experience and medical expertise. The opportunity to influence veteran healthcare policy at the congressional level represented exactly the kind of meaningful service I had hoped my military career might lead to, though I had never imagined it would happen so quickly or prominently. Preparing for congressional testimony required extensive briefings with Pentagon policy staff and veteran advocacy organizations. The process revealed how my unique background as a female combat medic and Medal of Honor recipient gave me credibility with diverse constituencies, who might otherwise dismiss each other's perspectives. Conservative members respected my military credentials and combat experience, while progressive members valued my advocacy for inclusive policies and veteran health care improvements. My testimony could potentially bridge political divides that typically prevented progress on veteran issues. The week before my scheduled testimony, I received another surprise call, this time from Mark, my brother. His tone was different from our usual conversations, more respectful and curious than the patronizing concern he typically displayed about my military career. "Hana," he began, "I've been reading about this testimony you're giving to Congress. Some of my colleagues at the hospital are really interested in your work with combat medicine. They're saying you're becoming an expert on trauma care in high-stress environments." The conversation that followed was the first time Mark had ever engaged seriously with my professional expertise. He asked detailed questions about combat medical procedures, triage protocols under fire, and psychological factors affecting patient care in dangerous situations. His questions revealed genuine professional interest rather than polite family curiosity, and I found myself discussing medical techniques and decision-making frameworks with someone who could understand the clinical complexity involved. "You know," Mark said toward the end of our conversation, "I never really understood what you did in the Army. I guess I thought it was like being a paramedic or something. But this trauma surgery under fire, the leadership responsibilities, the policy work you're doing now, it's actually pretty impressive from a medical standpoint. The acknowledgement felt like a breakthrough, the first time a family member had recognized my work on its own merits rather than measuring it against civilian alternatives. The change in Mark's perspective became more apparent when he called back the next day with a request that surprised me. "My hospital is hosting a trauma medicine conference next month," he said. "The chief of surgery asked if I could reach out to you about possibly speaking to our staff about combat trauma techniques. He said some of the procedures you've developed in the field could be valuable for our emergency room protocols." The invitation represented a form of professional validation I had never expected from anyone in my family circle. As the day of my congressional testimony approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. 8 years ago, I had enlisted as a confused teenager seeking direction and purpose. My family had viewed the decision as evidence of my inability to succeed in conventional paths, a temporary detour from the stable civilian life they wanted for me. Now I was preparing to testify before Congress as a nationally recognized expert on combat medicine and veteran affairs, with opportunities to influence policy that could affect thousands of service members and veterans. The irony was profound, but no longer painful. My family's lack of understanding had forced me to find validation and community elsewhere, leading me to excel in ways that might never have been possible if I had stayed on the conventional path they preferred. Their absence from my Medal of Honor ceremony had been devastating in the moment, but it had also freed me from the need to translate my achievements into terms they could appreciate. The recognition I was receiving from military leadership, government officials, and medical professionals was meaningful precisely because it came from people who understood the value of what I had accomplished. The night before my testimony, Emma called from Des Moines to wish me luck and express her amazement at how much my life had changed since the ceremony. "Hana," she said, "I've been following all the interviews and articles about you, and I keep thinking about how proud I am to know you. But I also keep thinking about your family, and how they must be feeling now that they realize what they missed." Her observation prompted me to consider whether my family's recent attempts at connection represented genuine recognition of my achievements, or simply a response to my newly visible public profile. The question felt less important than it might have weeks earlier. Whether my family ever fully understood or appreciated my military service had become secondary to the meaningful work I was now positioned to do. The Medal of Honor had opened doors to influence and responsibility that aligned perfectly with my values and expertise. The validation I had once sought from my family was being provided by people whose opinion carried professional weight and whose support could enable me to serve others more effectively. As I reviewed my testimony notes one final time, I realized that the girl who had left Cedar Falls 8 years ago seeking direction had found not just purpose but a platform to make a difference. The Medal of Honor was not the culmination of my service but the beginning of a new chapter where my experience and expertise could benefit service members, veterans, and the broader community in ways I was only beginning to understand. 6 months after the Medal of Honor ceremony, I stood in the briefing room of the Pentagon, addressing a joint committee of military leaders and congressional representatives about the implementation of new combat medic protocols. The PowerPoint slides behind me displayed survival statistics that had improved dramatically since we'd begun incorporating the techniques I'd developed during my deployment in Afghanistan. As I clicked to the final slide showing a 23% increase in battlefield survival rates, the room erupted in applause from people who understood exactly what those numbers represented in terms of lives saved. Senator Patricia Walsh, the committee chair, leaned forward at the conclusion of my presentation. "Sergeant First Class Mitchell, these results are extraordinary. The families of service members across this country owe you a debt of gratitude, not just for your heroic actions that earned you the Medal of Honor, but for your continued service in developing these life-saving protocols." The formal recognition from one of the most influential voices on veteran affairs felt surreal, yet it had become my new normal over the past months. My phone buzzed with a text message as the committee session concluded. It was from Jessica, something that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. "Saw your testimony on C-SPAN during my lunch break. Mom DVR'd it and made Dad watch it when he got home from work. He actually paused it to take notes when you were talking about the medical innovations. I think they're finally starting to get it. The message represented progress I had stopped expecting but found myself grateful to receive. The transformation in my family's perception had been gradual but undeniable. It began with Mark's genuine interest in my medical expertise and slowly expanded as media coverage made my achievements impossible to ignore. My parents had started mentioning my work to their friends, initially with the cautious pride of people sharing news they didn't fully understand, but increasingly with confidence, as positive reactions validated their daughter's accomplishments. The local newspaper in Cedar Falls had run 3 feature articles about my Pentagon work, each one prompting calls from neighbors and family friends expressing amazement at my career trajectory. The real breakthrough had come during my first visit home since the ceremony, a trip I'd postponed for months while establishing myself in my new Pentagon role. I'd finally agreed to a brief visit during a speaking engagement at the University of Iowa, planning to spend just one night with my family before returning to Washington. What I discovered was a household that had been quietly transformed by the unavoidable evidence of my success and national recognition. My childhood bedroom had been converted into what my mother called a memorial room, though she was embarrassed to use that term when showing it to me. The walls displayed framed newspaper articles about my Medal of Honor ceremony, photos from my various television appearances, and copies of the congressional testimony that had been quoted in policy documents. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star I'd earned during my deployments, which had been stored in a drawer during previous visits, were now prominently displayed alongside certificates from speaking engagements and awards from veteran organizations. "We wanted to make sure we had everything documented," my mother explained, her voice carrying an emotion I'd rarely heard when she discussed my military career. "People keep asking us about your achievements, and we realized we hadn't been paying close enough attention to everything you were accomplishing." The admission was as close to an apology as my mother was capable of offering, and I found myself more moved by her effort than I'd expected to be. The dinner conversation that evening was unlike any we'd shared since my enlistment. Instead of polite inquiries about my well-being followed by subtle suggestions about civilian career alternatives, my parents asked detailed questions about my work developing military medical policy. My father had researched my congressional testimony and wanted to understand how combat medic training had evolved since Vietnam, when he'd briefly considered military service before choosing college instead. The engagement was genuine, rather than perfunctory, suggesting that they were finally seeing my career as something worthy of their intellectual curiosity. Jessica's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. Her promotion celebration, which had seemed so important that it justified missing my Medal of Honor ceremony, had apparently been overshadowed by the national attention my award received. Several of her colleagues at the consulting firm had seen my media appearances and expressed amazement that Jessica's sister was the Medal of Honor recipient they'd been reading about. The recognition from her professional peers had forced Jessica to confront the significance of achievements she'd previously dismissed as interesting but irrelevant to real success. "I owe you an apology," Jessica said during a private conversation on my last morning home. "I've been thinking about this for months, and I realize I never understood what you were building in the military. I thought you were just marking time until you figured out what you really wanted to do." She paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally to her. "Watching you testify to Congress, seeing how seriously those senators took your recommendations, reading about the policies you're influencing, I finally get that this isn't just a job for you. You're actually changing things that matter." The acknowledgement meant more to me than I'd anticipated, perhaps because it came from someone whose approval I'd sought for so many years. But I also realized that Jessica's recognition, while gratifying, was no longer essential to my sense of accomplishment. The work I was doing spoke for itself, and the community I'd found in military and veteran circles provided validation that was both meaningful and sustainable. My family's evolving understanding was welcome but not necessary for my continued success and satisfaction. The speaking engagement at the University of Iowa Medical School that had prompted my visit home proved to be a powerful reminder of how far I'd traveled from my origins in Cedar Falls. The auditorium was packed with medical students, faculty, and practicing physicians, who had come to hear about trauma medicine innovations developed in combat environments. As I described the decision-making frameworks and triage protocols that had emerged, from my battlefield experience, I could see in the audience's faces the same respect and engagement I'd grown accustomed to receiving from military and policy audiences. Dr. Michael Foster, the dean of the medical school, introduced me with language that would have been incomprehensible to my family just a year earlier. Sergeant First Class Mitchell represents the evolution of military medicine into a sophisticated specialty that combines advanced clinical skills with tactical expertise and policy development. Her work is reshaping how we approach trauma care not just in military settings but in civilian emergency medicine as well. The introduction positioned my military career as a natural progression of medical excellence rather than an alternative to civilian achievement. The questions from medical students revealed how my path had inspired others to consider military service as a route to medical advancement rather than a detour from it. Several students asked about opportunities to develop emergency medicine skills through military training, viewing combat medic experience as valuable preparation for civilian trauma medicine careers. The shift in perception was remarkable. Military medical service was being seen as cutting-edge professional development rather than a consolation prize for those who couldn't succeed in civilian medicine. After the presentation, Dr. Foster approached me with an unexpected proposal. The medical school was developing a new program in emergency and trauma medicine that would include rotations at military medical facilities and training in combat casualty care. They wanted me to serve as a consulting faculty member, helping to design curriculum that would bridge military and civilian medical practices. The offer represented exactly the kind of academic recognition that my family had always valued, but it was being extended because of my military expertise rather than despite it. The opportunity to influence medical education felt like a natural extension of the policy work I was doing at the Pentagon. Military medicine had always been at the forefront of trauma care innovation, but the knowledge transfer between military and civilian sectors had been limited. A formal academic program could help spread life-saving techniques developed in combat to emergency rooms and trauma centers across the country. The potential impact on civilian healthcare outcomes was substantial and aligned perfectly with my commitment to using my expertise for maximum benefit. As I returned to Washington and my responsibilities at the Pentagon, I found myself reflecting on the complete transformation of my circumstances over the past year. The confused teenager who had enlisted in the Army as an escape from family disappointment had become a nationally recognized expert, whose recommendations influenced policy at the highest levels of government. The military career my family had viewed as a dead end had opened doors to influence and opportunity that exceeded anything they had envisioned for conventional success. The invitations and opportunities continued to multiply in ways that sometimes felt overwhelming. Harvard Medical School wanted me to participate in a symposium on emergency medicine innovations. The Brookings Institution invited me to contribute to a policy paper on veteran healthcare reform. The International Association of Combat Medics asked me to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference in Geneva. Each opportunity represented a chance to advance causes I cared about, while building expertise and influence that would serve me throughout my career. Perhaps most significantly, I had been selected for the Army's Advanced Civil Schooling Program, which would fund my pursuit of a master's degree in public policy at Georgetown University while I continued my Pentagon duties. The program was highly competitive, reserved for officers and senior enlisted personnel identified as future military leaders. My selection represented not just recognition of past achievements, but investment in my potential for even greater responsibility and influence in the years ahead. The irony of my family's evolution was that their approval finally came at a time when I no longer needed it for validation. The work I was doing was meaningful and impactful regardless of whether they understood its significance. The community I'd found among military leaders, policy experts, and medical professionals provided the professional recognition and personal support that I'd once sought from family relationships. Their growing pride in my achievements was pleasant but no longer essential to my sense of self-worth. The medal around my neck had become more than a symbol of past heroism. It had become a tool for future service. The credibility it provided allowed me to advocate for military personnel and veterans in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. The platform it created enabled me to influence policies that could save lives and improve care for thousands of service members. The recognition it brought opened doors to opportunities where my expertise could make a meaningful difference. During a recent interview with Military Times about the future of combat medicine, the reporter asked about my long-term goals and whether I planned to remain in military service throughout my career. My answer surprised even me with its clarity and conviction. The Army gave me the opportunity to discover capabilities I never knew I had and to develop expertise that can serve others. Why would I want to leave an institution that continues to provide new challenges and opportunities to make a meaningful impact? The question of whether to pursue civilian alternatives, which had dominated family conversations for years, had become irrelevant to my own decision-making. The girl who had left Cedar Falls 8 years ago seeking direction and purpose had found both in abundance. More importantly, I had discovered that success and fulfillment could be defined on my own terms rather than measured against others' expectations. The Medal of Honor had validated my service in the most public way possible, but the real transformation had been internal. The realization that my worth wasn't dependent on external approval, even from people whose opinions had once seemed essential to my happiness. As I prepared for my next congressional testimony, this time on veteran mental health initiatives, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. The family that had once seen my military service as evidence of confused priorities now spoke proudly about my achievements to anyone who would listen. The career they had viewed as a temporary detour had become a platform for influence and impact that exceeded their most ambitious hopes for conventional success. The recognition was gratifying, but it paled in comparison to the satisfaction of knowing that my work was making a difference in the lives of service members and veterans across the country. The policies I helped develop would save lives on future battlefields. The training protocols I designed would better prepare combat medics for the challenges they would face. The advocacy I provided would improve healthcare access for veterans, who deserved the best care our nation could provide. Standing in my Pentagon office, looking out at the Potomac River and the memorials that honored previous generations of service members, I felt a profound sense of purpose and belonging. This was where I was meant to be, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who understood and valued my contributions. The path that had once seemed like an escape from family expectations had become the foundation for a life of meaning and impact that exceeded anything I had dared to imagine when I first raised my right hand and took the oath to defend my country. The teenager who had enlisted as an act of rebellion had become a woman whose service embodied the highest ideals of military dedication and public service. The recognition had been wonderful, but the real victory was the knowledge that I had found my calling and was using every opportunity to serve others with the same dedication and courage that had earned me the nation's highest honor. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.